Welcome back. In this lecture, we'll be spending all our time on the very rich subject of early Irish literature. Now, the medieval Irish wrote copiously in Latin. We have Latin annals kept in monasteries, Latin saints' lives, Latin theological texts, all kinds of material written in Latin. But the thing that sets the Irish apart from every other people in Europe in the early Middle Ages is how much they wrote in their own language. The Irish produced the largest body of medieval texts, not just in any Celtic language, but in any vernacular language whatsoever. For the period before the year 1000, there are literally hundreds of medieval Irish stories, compared to a few tales and fragments in French or German. And the literature that survives is rich and varied. So it is mostly that vernacular literary phenomenon that I'll be talking about in this lecture. Since there is so much material that survives, we'll only be able to scratch the surface, but I want to accomplish two main goals. First, I'll say something about how literature functioned in Irish society. What was the role of literature, and what was the status of the people who produced it? This discussion will help us to understand why this extensive literary tradition flourished. Then I want to introduce you to some of the most important texts, concentrating first on those texts that tell us something profound about how early Irish society worked. That is, texts that give us a window onto the way in which the Irish thought about kingship or fate or love, all the really big questions. But I'll also concentrate on texts that would play a major role in the Celtic revival in the 19th and 20th centuries, as a means of asserting a specifically Irish and Celtic identity. So let's start by talking about the importance of literature to medieval Irish society. It's hard to overstate this importance, because in early Irish society, the highest grade of poets literally had the status of kings. They had the same honor price as a king or a bishop. That is, you had to pay the same very high amount to compensate their kin if they were injured or killed. And poets were some of the only people who could move freely throughout the countryside, from one petty kingdom to another, without needing to ask permission to enter a new territory. The reason this was so is that they were highly skilled, and their skills were highly sought after. It might take 20 years to fully train an Irish poet, because most of the tales would have been passed down from one generation to the next. There were families who specialized in producing poets, families that were later attached to specific clans in Ireland and Scotland, and worked in some cases exclusively for that clan. So what was the job of a poet? Why would a clan chief want to pay to support a full-time literary specialist? Well, it was quite a self-interested proposition. Early Irish kings, and later clan chiefs, commissioned poets to sing their praises. Keep in mind that this was a society that functioned on reputation. Status was delineated not just by how many cattle you had, but on how good a poet you could employ to boast about you. As with the art of Celtic-speaking countries, where the labor involved was a sign of the wealth of the patron who paid for it, the more elaborate and skillful the poem, the richer and more powerful the subject. Or at least that was how it was perceived. Now, praise poetry mostly was meant to flatter the boss. But there was a flip side, namely satire, which was a special occupation. A satirist might make his patron's enemies look bad by insulting their martial prowess, or their success with women, or their appearance. It must be said, the satires are much more interesting than the praise poems. They could be quite vicious. Really, they were character assassinations. And satire was seen as literally a deadly weapon. There are stories about people who were satirized and fell down dead as a result. The interesting thing about the profession of satirist is that it doesn't seem to have been limited to males. In the epic called the Táin, which I will talk about more in a moment, there is a woman satirist named Leversham, and people are terrified of her. Now, did the early Irish really believe that satire could kill you? I don't think so. The death that is referred to in these texts is more of a social death, in which the satirist has exposed the subject to such ridicule that they can't show their face in polite society. But it's important, I think, that the Irish felt so strongly about the power of words. So the need for praise poetry was a huge part of the reason why the literary infrastructure of early Ireland was so extensive. But praise poems or satires are not the only kind of texts that we have from this period. Noble Irish patrons also felt called upon to provide their followers with other kinds of literary entertainment. And those are the texts that are still really fun to read. Let me say, though, Irish literature has a very distinctive feel to it. There are many features that are unfamiliar to modern audiences, and some of them take some getting used to. I think it would help for me to explain these elements a bit before we discuss the tales themselves. One of these distinctive features is the plots. Until rather recently, most plots in the broader European literary tradition were fairly linear in structure. Generally speaking, they tended to begin at the beginning and proceed till the end without a lot of jumping around. Most of the time, the point is to find out what happened, especially in thrillers, mysteries, and so on. Irish stories, however, are not nearly as plot-driven. They can be full of digressions, and in some cases, the digressions threaten to overwhelm the plot. In fact, some literary scholars suggest, and I think they must be right, that plot is not really the point. Sometimes the plot seems to come to a grinding halt, so that the teller of the tale can give us, for example, a very long list of names. In many cases, these are characters we don't learn anything else about in that particular tale. These are clearly references to other tales that the audience was expected to know, but they can be very cryptic to us. Sometimes we also get long genealogical digressions. These were extremely important to an audience whose family relationships determined almost everything about their social status, their property rights, etc. These passages are the most likely to be quietly dropped by modern translators. But one of the most interesting forms of digression in Irish stories is the place name story. The Irish were absolutely obsessed with place names. Seemingly every geographical feature in the Irish landscape had a name, and in the stories, place names serve as a kind of memory aid. If you're trying to remember the name of a particular hill, it helps if there is a story about it. Or perhaps the place name existed before the story, and the story was invented to explain the place name. Most of the time, that is probably what we're dealing with, but we'll never be sure. There were so many of these stories that they received their own genre name, Din Shenachas, or the lore of places. The Shenachas part of the word comes from the word for old, as in lore that is passed down from the older generation, and it's related to the modern Irish word Shanachie, or storyteller. Sometimes Din Shenachas can seem rather random, like the storyteller is going a long way to get there. Sometimes, though, these stories are very well integrated into the plot. For example, in the Táin, the hero Cuchulainn, who is defying the men of Connacht, comes to a ford called Athgrena, the Sunny Ford. He lays down a challenge to his enemies by cutting the fork of a tree with one stroke of his sword. He uses the fork to carve a message of defiance in Ogham's script. When 4 of his enemies nevertheless approach him, he cuts off all 4 of their heads and sticks them on the 4 prongs of the fork. The ford is renamed Athgavla, the ford of the fork, ever after. This is a very memorable story. You won't forget the name of that ford, probably ever, because you will have a mental image of 4 heads spiked on a tree branch. The reason this kind of story mattered, of course, is that Ireland was a society without maps. These stories were their maps, and they were so specific and so evocative that we can now actually trace in the landscape where many of these stories supposedly took place. It's a very striking fact about early Irish literature that it is tied so closely to the landscape of Ireland. Another noticeable feature of Irish literature is that it tends to fall into very specific genres. In fact, we have several surviving tale lists from the Middle Ages that put the early Irish tales into these categories. For example, we might have a broad category such as the rom-com or the bromance. The Irish had a category called the Death of Kings. which was pretty much what you would think it was. This practice of putting tales into very specific mental pigeonholes surely helped the bards to remember them. This way, if somebody requested a tale about the death of a king, say, or about a voyage to the other world, or the elopement of two lovers, these are all actual genres, the bard would be able to pull out of his memory various examples of the genre in question. I just want to mention one more characteristic of Irish tales that might have been implicit in the category called the death of kings. It is the fact that these Irish tales are not like a modern page-turner. Not at all. We are not meant to be surprised by the ending. In fact, almost everybody hearing the tale will know the ending, and it is often given away at the start of the story. Suspense is not the point. Novelty is not the point. This is a tradition that is focused mostly on preserving stories that have value in the present, not about inventing something new. Now, the multitude of medieval classifications for these tales can be somewhat unwieldy to work with. So instead, modern scholars have grouped these tales into 4 big cycles that are distinguished more by subject matter rather than by tale type. So there is more than one tale type in each of these cycles. But I think it will be easier to keep the tale straight if we follow the modern distinctions rather than the medieval ones. The 4 big cycles, in roughly chronological order, are as follows. First, the mythological cycle, which covers the peopling of Ireland and the early clashes between the early inhabitants and various supernatural beings. Second, the Ulster cycle, which deals with the conflict between 2 provinces of Ireland, Ulster and Connacht, especially with the great cattle raid that is the subject of the Irish epic, the Táin. Third, the King Tales, which take place during the early centuries after the conversion of Ireland to Christianity. Some of these are probably based on real events and real kings, even if a little bit loosely. And fourth, the Oisin cycle. These are tales that take place in the later medieval period, concerning the great warrior Finn McCool and his band of companions, as well as Finn's son, Oisin. I'm going to discuss the first 3 cycles in this lecture, and the 4th in a later lecture on the discovery of the Celts in early modern Europe, because it's an important part of that story. Let's start with the first of these cycles, the mythological cycle. This cycle is important for scholars for various reasons, but perhaps mostly because this is one of the only places we can look to try to recover something of pre-Christian Irish religion or mythology. The tales take place in a distant pre-Christian past, and they include many supernatural elements. And in fact, the supernatural is not far to seek in Irish literature generally, but it is particularly pronounced in the mythological cycle. One of the most important threads in this cycle includes the stories of the peopling of Ireland that came to be known as the Leabhar Gabhála Érenn, or the Book of Invasions. I have talked in general terms about this text in my lecture on early Irish history, but here I want to describe in more detail 2 closely related tales from this tradition, because I think they give us a good sense of this material. The 2 tales are called the First Battle of Moytura and the Second Battle of Moytura. And due to the very specific place name lore contained in the tales, we know where they are set. The first is near Cong in County Mayo, and the second is by Lough Arrow in County Sligo. We're told that the people known as the Nemedians have left Ireland in 3 separate groups to escape the Fomorian giants. First, one of these groups, the Fir Bolg, returns to Ireland from exile in Greece and conquers the Fomorians, but then a second group, known as the Tuatha Dé Danann, arrives. The Tuatha are just a little bit magic, and in fact, they may be members of an original pagan pantheon. Under the leadership of their king, Nuada, the Tuatha arrive in Ireland to demand that the Fir Bolg either face them in battle or concede half of the island to them. Of course, the choice is for battle, and Nuada ends up facing the champion of the Fir Bolg, a man named Sreng. Sreng cuts off Nuada's right hand, but the Tuatha win the battle. They call a truce, and once again give the Fir Bolg the choice of whether to continue fighting, leave Ireland altogether, or share the island with the Tuatha. Sreng proposes a single combat with Nuada, but Nuada will only agree to fight if Sreng will bind up one of his arms so that the two men are fighting on an even playing field. Sreng refuses, and the Firbolg are confined to the province of Connacht, leaving the rest of the island to the Tuatha. It's a little weird so far, but it's about to get weirder. One of the Tuatha, Dian Cecht, who is pretty clearly a god of healing, gives Nuada a new artificial hand, which earns Nuada the nickname of Nuada Argetlav, or Nuada of the Silver Hand. But it turns out that kings cannot have any physical blemishes, because they need to represent the integrity of the people. So for 7 years, the Tuatha are ruled by a different king named Bress, who is part Tuatha, part Fomorian giant. Once Bress dies, Nuada's arm is restored, and he is put back on the throne. Now we come to the second battle of Moytura, which is kind of a sequel, except not really, because some details are changed. Here we find that Bress is more of a villain. His Fomorian ancestry causes him to oppress the Tuatha, and he also fails to offer the kind of hospitality expected of a king. So Bress is deposed, and Nuada's flesh regrows over his silver arm. So he is restored to the throne. The big difference between the stories is that in the first story, Nuada is restored because Bress dies, but in the second story, Bress is deposed. So Bress leads a counter-revolution with the help of a Fomorian named Balor of the Evil Eye. In the ensuing battle, Nuada is killed, but a new Tuatha champion named Luch is triumphant. Bress survives, and his life is spared on the condition that he teach the rather artsy Tuatha how to farm, which he does. This does not make a whole lot of sense. We have signs that at least 2 versions of the story must have circulated, and we also suspect that what we see here are gods who have been dumbed down into human form. Luch, for example, has a name that clearly links him to the continental Celtic god who gave his name to many places across Europe, including Lugdunum in France, which is modern Lyon. The point, though, is that these are fundamentally tales about the right way to rule. Kings who do not meet their subjects' expectations can expect to face a challenge. If the mythological cycle takes place at some sort of early phase of the settlement of Ireland, the next cycle I want to talk about, the Ulster cycle, belongs to a slightly more recognizable, but still pre-Christian past. The most famous story in the cycle, the Táin, or as it is often translated into English, the cattle raid of Cooley. It has been described as a window on the Iron Age because it seems to record conditions in Ireland right before the conversion of Ireland to Christianity. The Táin has also been referred to as the Irish Iliad, and in fact the parallels are kind of close. Just like the Iliad, the Táin starts with a kidnapping, but instead of a queen, the victim is a bull, the brown bull of Cooley, and just as in the Iliad, a war is fought to recover the victim. The Táin also has its heroes, the most important of which by far is Cuchulainn, who is at the same time one of the most impressive and most bizarre heroes in all of epic literature. He has some traits in common with Achilles. For example, neither Cuchulainn nor Achilles is a mere mortal, but whereas with Achilles it's a pretty straightforward case of a mortal woman conceiving a child with a god, Cuchulainn's case is much more complicated. Cuchulainn represents a wonderful example of a very distinctive trait in Irish literature, namely the multiple conception of the hero. Let me run through the details because I think this will make it quite clear how unclear the story is. We start with the king of Ulster, named Conchobar, who is confronted with a plague of 90 birds who eat the crops of the Ulstermen. So he goes out with his followers in chariots to drive the birds away. The king's daughter, Dectana, is with him, since she is his charioteer. The birds are in fact driven away, but we know right away that there is something unusual about the birds, because each pair of birds is linked by a silver chain. That is a clear sign that they are supernatural. Three birds break away and make for the Bruna Boyne, which refers to the area where the passage graves can be found by the River Boyne. And I should point out here that the early Irish were absolutely fascinated by these megalithic monuments. They just didn't know anything more about them than we do, since they were already thousands of years old. Then the men of Ulster sought shelter in a nearby house where a woman was giving birth, and Dectana went to help her, and she ended up nursing the baby boy. The next morning, they woke to find the house and the mother and father of the boy were gone, and only the boy remained. The boy was taken back to Ulster, but after some years in Dectana's care, he died, and she was greatly saddened. Dectana requested water, and every time she went to drink it, a tiny creature would leap from the water towards her lips, but once she took the vessel away, there was nothing there. That night she dreamed that a man called Luch, notice the name, told her that he was the one who had brought her to the Brugh, and that she was pregnant by him. And Dectana did prove to be pregnant, which perturbed the Ulstermen because they thought she was pregnant by her own father, the king. To deal with the embarrassment, the men of Ulster married off Dectana to a man called Saltive. But because Dectana thought it was improper to go to one man's bed while pregnant by another, she lay down on the bed and crushed the child within her. And then she became pregnant by her new husband and had a son. The strangest part of all of this is that somehow, even though the first two children die, they are both also Cuchulainn, which means that he is somehow the son of the god Luch. Achilles' conception and birth may be supernatural, but it is a lot simpler. And if we continue the comparison between Cuchulainn and Achilles, we might look at their physical descriptions. Achilles is conventionally handsome. Cuchulainn is not. This is how he is described in the Táin. His hair was arranged in 3 layers, dark next to the scalp, blood red in the middle, and yellow at the ends, which were set like a gold crown on his head, falling to the nape of the neck in a braid of 3 coils, with little ringlets and gold shiny strands combed out in artful disarray about his shoulders. 100 curls of purple gold shone round his neck. 100 amber beaded ribbons bedecked his head. He had 4 dimples in each cheek, yellow, green, blue, and purple. 7 brilliant gems gleamed in each regal eye. Each foot had 7 toes, and each hand 7 fingers, the nails or claws or talons of each with the grip of a hawk or a griffin. And this is Cuchulainn on a good day. When his battle rage is on him, he goes into what translators have variously called his warp spasm or his torque, which is some kind of frightening contortion that has a dramatic effect on an already unusual-looking young man. His hair stood on end. You'd think each hair had been hammered into his head. Each hair seemed tipped with a spark, so sharply did they shoot upright. He closed one eye as narrow as the eye of a needle. He opened the other as wide as the mouth of a goblet. He bared his teeth from ear to ear. He opened his gob so wide you could see the inside of his gullet. The hero's light sprang from the crown of his head. Needless to say, he is pretty close to unbeatable, especially when his torque is on him. Alongside Cuchulainn, the most compelling character in the Táin is undoubtedly Maeve, Queen of Connacht. It is Maeve, after all, who starts off the whole story of the cattle raid because she is jealous of her husband's bull. I have more to say about Maeve in my lecture on social structure and the role of women in Celtic society, so I'll leave her aside for now, except to say that she seems to be descended from a goddess figure linked to sovereignty and intoxication. The Ulster cycle ends with the victory of the Ulstermen over Connacht, but in the process, huge slaughter is done on both sides, and the brown bull is killed. Maeve's jealousy has had terrible consequences, but she has at least allowed for our hero to show himself at his most heroic. But the text is not just about fighting. It is about the pain caused when men are forced to preserve their honor at the cost of rupturing some of the closest social bonds known to Irish society. Cuchulainn tries in vain to avoid fighting his foster brother, Ferdia, but he cannot do so without shame, and so he chooses to kill Ferdia, but his heart is broken. So now I want to move on to the third cycle, the tales of the Irish kings. Here we have a recognizable, though still ancient, Christianized Ireland, although there's still a lot of mythological material, and it's clear that the transition to Christianity has not been seamless. The reason these tales are so important is that they have a serious point to make about the proper exercise of kingship in Ireland. Let's look at kingship at 2 points in its life cycle, as the tales do, when a king takes the throne and when he dies. I want to talk now about one of the most important Irish myths, the myth of the goddess of sovereignty. The goddess of sovereignty was the embodiment of the right to rule, and it was the goddess who conveyed this right on individual rulers. You needed the approval of the goddess if you were going to be a successful king whom everyone acknowledged as the rightful king. This myth is absolutely essential to Irish literature. We will see it crop up again and again throughout the rest of these lectures. Let me give you a quick summary of one of its most important appearances. In this story, we have a familiar situation in Irish literature. Namely, there is a king's son who is trying to make his way in the world, but he is the youngest in a large family of brothers, and moreover, his mother is not the official wife of the king, but rather a servant of lower status. So he's got something to prove. The name of the youngest brother is Niall. One day, he is out with his older half-brothers, and they come across a hideous old woman. She offers them a drink from her well, but she is only willing to give them the water if they will pay a small price. She wants a kiss. Now, she is totally loathsome to look at. None of the brothers want to kiss her. But the youngest brother leaps at the opportunity. He says that not only will he kiss her, he will lie with her as well. He has demonstrated his good faith, and at that moment, the loathsome hag is transformed into a beautiful young woman. And presumably only after the transformation does Niall have to carry through on his promise to the ex-hag. It turns out, of course, that the woman represents the sovereignty of Ireland. And Niall does go on to become king. In fact, the very famous king known as Niall of the Nine Hostages. So what do we make of this story? It's famous in later literature as the central motif of the Wife of Bath's tale in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But in Ireland, it had a very important political meaning. The idea was that sovereignty was hard to acquire, but beautiful to keep. For the Irish, stories of this kind were deeply political. Literature in Ireland was never just for entertainment. Of course, people in early Ireland were sophisticated consumers of these literary traditions. They could recognize a good allegory when they saw one. They did not believe that the goddess literally chose the successful claimant for the throne. But these stories about the sovereignty goddess helped to ratify the results of what could be an extremely messy and even bloody process. Many stories of the sovereignty goddess are about acquiring the throne, but a lot of them are also about losing the throne. That is, they fall into the enormous genre I mentioned earlier, the death of kings. The most famous of these is the tale of the destruction of Darderga's hostel, in which an unjust king is punished for violating his responsibility to provide equal justice to his subjects. In this story, King Conor is promised that if he avoids violating certain gesa or taboos, such as not allowing 3 red-headed men to precede him into the house of a red-headed man, he will be a successful king. So Conor rules justly, and as a result, the land flourishes. But Conor has a problem: his foster brothers. They are not good men. In fact, they are criminals, and Conor is caught between his duty to punish wrongdoers and his personal obligation to his foster brothers. So rather than treat them as they deserve, he merely banishes them. But they continue to raid Conor's kingdom, and as a result, the good omens of Conor's early reign are reversed. The weather worsens, and the crops wither. And Connor is forced repeatedly to violate the Gesa that he was told he must not violate. Connor is drawn into a final battle against the marauders, and he is killed. It's a strange story, full of the kinds of digressions I mentioned earlier, but it's also interesting for another reason I mentioned, which is that we are never in any doubt about what is going to happen. When we are told what Connor's Gesa are, we know he will violate them all, and that he is doomed. When faced with a moral dilemma, he chose wrong, and the story punishes him for it. The King Tales were very much meant, I think, as cautionary tales for contemporary kings. Of course, the actual kings who heard these stories were not really worrying about whether 3 red-headed people were entering a house before them. But they probably were worrying, and rightly so, about the political temperature in the room when the tale was being told. As we've seen, Irish literature tends to concentrate on things not being quite what they seem. Narratives are disjointed. Time and place don't work quite the way we expect them to, and even the process of giving birth is far more complicated than it is in everyday life. If you're looking for realism, this is not your literature. But in these texts, we get a fascinating glimpse of what this society valued. Mighty deeds, sure, but also honor and justice.